My guest tonight is Professor Graeme MacQueen. Professor MacQueen is a retired member of the Religious Studies Department at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. He received his doctorate in Buddhist Studies from Harvard University. In 1989, Professor MacQueen helped found McMaster's Center for Peace Studies, which he directed from 1989 to 1996. He is now the co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies. Professor MacQueen is the author of the 2001 Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy, which is the topic of tonight's discussion. Professor MacQueen, you wrote that book last year, roughly 13 years after the event. Why did you decide to write that book at that point, so many years after the event?
Well, thank you, Tim. When you put it that way, that's a very good question. Why does somebody decide 13 years after an historical event to suddenly write about it? Some of it had to do with my own gradual awakening into the importance of the anthrax attacks, and then also the sense that it would be strategically important to tell other people the things that I had learned, because I looked around me and I saw that many people had forgotten that these attacks even occurred, never mind what their significance was. And I began to think that the anthrax attacks might actually be the gateway into the larger fraud of the war on terror. I mean, you can enter into that fraud through any number of gateways, including, of course, 9/11. But there were some advantages to the anthrax attacks. For one thing, the anthrax attacks were an inside job and everybody knows it. In other words, here we have attacks that occurred right after 9/11 where the FBI and the Homeland Security admit, yeah, you're right. It was done by an insider who blamed it, who tried to frame extremist Muslims. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. So let's look into that a little more deeply. And then we find, I was shocked to find that the anthrax attacks were obviously connected directly to 9/11. And therefore, if we can see that they're connected, then once we realize the anthrax attacks were frauds, we see that 9/11 had to be a fraud too. And so both stories crumble, and then the whole global war on terror kind of goes up in smoke.
So basically the whole facade begins to crumble.
Right.
Yeah. Anthrax attacks, they started, I believe, a week after 9/11 and they carried through November. Can you give us a brief review of what happened and kind of give us a context?
Yeah, well, context is, of course, that the 9/11 attacks happened and caused a lot of shock and trauma and a feeling of being threatened and being endangered and being wounded. And we know about that. I mean, we all know that happened to the American population as a whole. But I like to stress, and I do stress in my book, that it also happened to the people's elected representatives. In other words, Congress was shocked and traumatized too. In fact, there was a widespread view on 9/11 that the U.S. Capitol was itself being targeted. And the feeling was among many people that Flight 93, United 93, was coming toward the U.S. Capitol. So the U.S. Capitol was evacuated very rapidly and in kind of a panic with, Congress people scattering in all directions. And from then on, for several months, Congress was not allowed to feel safe. There was, yellow kind of safety tape all around the place and concrete barriers and Congress being told more or less repeatedly, you are in danger of being attacked as a group. Someone might even try to wipe you all out. So don't wear your congressional pin to identify yourself as a congressperson. Don't use distinctive license plates. Be careful. So there's this whole campaign to get the people's elected representatives frightened, and that has big effects. Congress allows invasion and war. It allows the Patriot Act to go through, all these things. So this starts with 9/11, and it's very shortly after 9/11 that the Attorney General introduces what eventually became called the Patriot Act and starts trying to get it through very rapidly, astonishing rapidity. He wants it passed by Congress within a week of when he introduced it, which of course they refused to do that. So then you see it's in this context that the anthrax attacks are important. 9/11 already set up the U.S. population and their elected representatives. It made them scared. It made them kind of draw together like a herd of frightened animals. It got them to approve of aggression abroad. The invasion of Afghanistan, which would shortly be followed by the invasion of Iraq, and it also got them to give up their own civil rights at home, for example, through the Patriot Act. And by the way, those are two movements that are often connected. In times of war, when people feel threatened and endangered, they simultaneously attack others and surrender their own civil rights, so that you get the very low tolerance of dissent and a high level of aggression. So that's 9/11. Now, the anthrax attacks, as you say, they began a week after 9/11, although they weren't known to have happened that early. They didn't actually become known till, I don't even remember now, October 3rd or 4th. But yeah, they started pretty much right away. And they were like the second punch in a 1-2 punch scenario. So the U.S. population and Congress were feeling battered and scared. And now all of a sudden here are these letters, these envelopes containing spores of this lethal disease, anthrax, especially when you breathe it in. It's very, very dangerous. About 90% of people who contract inhalation anthrax from breathing in the spores will die typically. So these are being sent out. So it does the same thing. It follows through. So people are more willing to invade. They're more willing to give up their civil rights. And indeed, the anthrax attacks were clearly used to promote both of those. By mid-October, the theory was gaining ground that the anthrax attacks had a double perpetrator, that Al-Qaeda had done the deed, but it had gotten the anthrax from Iraq. Well, that's convenient, isn't it? That legitimates invading both the countries in question, Afghanistan, which supposedly housing Al-Qaeda, and Iraq. Meanwhile, at home, what does it do? Well, the Patriot Act had started to run into trouble. Congressmen and women weren't, they were pretty compliant, but not complete pushovers, and they were starting to push back a little, and it looked like it might run into trouble. So after 9/11, so then the anthrax attacks come, and more fear, and now Congress gets targeted, and letters are sent to 2 senators. I find a lot of Americans forget that the U.S. Congress was attacked with a weapon of mass destruction in 2001. This is quite something. People shouldn't forget this. Weaponized anthrax is obviously a biological weapon, and it's traditionally a weapon of mass destruction. Who were the senators that it got sent to? Well, Senator Daschle and Senator Leahy, both Democratic senators who were holding up passage of the Patriot Act. So, it doesn't take a genius to kind of see what's going on here. And, I was able to see what was going on, but I certainly wasn't the first person. And that's part of why I wrote the book. So that's sort of the context, and that's sort of what happened. The other thing I need to say, I guess, to complete this narrative is that unlike the 9/11 story of the 19 hijackers and all that, which is still being, kind of bravely maintained by the U.S. government and other governments, despite its obvious absurdity. Unlike that, the anthrax story actually collapsed quite quickly. In fact, almost directly after the passage of the Patriot Act, the anthrax attack story went into freefall, and it became clear that these anthrax spores had not come from Al-Qaeda, and they hadn't come from Iraq. They had come from deep within the U.S. military-industrial complex. They were actually from a highly secure biolab in the United States. And likewise, the letters that accompanied the spores, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great, were fakes. There was no evidence Muslims, extremist or otherwise, had anything whatsoever to do with this. So that then left the FBI with a problem. How do we admit it was an inside job without everything coming down around us? And we go on from there. But perhaps I should stop for now.
Yeah, because if you go back and through the coverage in the initial days of the attacks, there was a definite attempt to link it to 9/11.
Right,
There were various stories about, I believe, one of the alleged hijackers. There's a story in the news that he had subcutaneous anthrax.
right.
Um,
Well, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so there's a link there. Um, But then we go ahead and we find out that the source of the anthrax was well, I guess the AIM strain, but it came from one of these three sites. Was it Patel,
Right.
Dugway, and U.S. Amaret? I think or
Yeah,
Amaret or
USAMRID, they call it. Yeah.
US. So
Yeah,
these,
you're right. So it's from one of those three, or possibly two of those three. Yeah.
which doesn't explain why there were these stories linking it to 9/11. I mean, literally, not just the notes themselves, but the reports about these alleged hijackers being very interested in acquiring crop dusters, obtaining a loan from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and to spread anthrax, I believe, right, through a
Yeah,
dispersal
and
device.
I'm glad you brought that up because when I first began looking at the anthrax thing, which is somewhere around 2010, I'd already been involved in research about 9/11 for 5 years by that time, and had written some things about it, but I hadn't done anything. I didn't know anything about the anthrax attacks, so I started looking at them. And it doesn't take long to see that it was an inside job because everyone admits that. But my first real shock was what you just mentioned, namely that the anthrax attacks were obviously connected to 9/11. And one of the reasons that we could see that was, as you said, the so-called 19 hijackers who are talked about so much as having done the 9/11 attacks were linked to the anthrax attacks. And nobody had somehow told me that before. So I was quite surprised when I discovered that. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to show people that you can't do what the FBI wants us to do, which is to say 9/11 attacks were genuinely by extremist Muslims. They're over there in the corner. And the anthrax attacks were by fake extremist Muslims. And they're over in a different corner. And there's no connection between them. No, you can't do that. They were connected, and the 19 hijackers are one of the strongest links.
Another strange coincidence was I'll let you tell it because I think you're more informed. You probably remember the details more, but the real estate agent for two of the hijackers was also a real estate agent for one of the victims of the anthrax attacks, correct?
Yeah, yeah. Again, I
Spell
was
that out because I want people should cogitate on that for a while. What are the odds of a nation of 320 million souls?
right.
But go ahead, explain that. Go ahead.
Well, no, exactly, exactly. So 320 million roughly people in the U.S., and suddenly we discovered that the first guy to die from the anthrax attacks, Robert Stevens, died on, I don't have my notes here, but it was October 5th, I think it was. So we're almost on the anniversary of his death, just a few days later. Um, he died of pulmonary or inhalation anthrax. Now, okay, he was a photo editor in Florida. We won't get into the details here, but as you say, the interesting thing is his friend and former real estate agent, Gloria Irish, was also the real estate agent of two of the hijackers, the so-called 19 hijackers. And she wasn't just, in a technical sense, their real estate agent. I mean, she came to know them somewhat. She drove them around town. She found them a couple of apartments, and then a bunch of other so-called hijackers lived in those apartments so that the places that she found these guys became considered a terrorist hotbed in Florida. So yeah, she is a direct link between anthrax and 9/11. And of course, she denied it. Oh, no, it's just coincidence. But no, I'm sorry. She is a link. She's only one of several links, but
Mm-hmm.
one of the most dramatic. And as you say, what are the odds of the first anthrax death, the man having the same real estate agent as a couple of the hijackers? Very, very bizarre.
At the same time, the letters that went out were these crude misspellings, Allah's great type letters, messages. Obviously, whoever sent the letter was trying to link it to Islamic terrorism.
Yes, yes.
So that we have that
Not only
connection.
not,
So
not only that, Tim, but if you look at the letters that were recovered, they're not only extremist Muslim caricatures, but they've also got 9/11 written at the top as the date, basically. So they are explicitly saying we are linked. We're the same people that did 9/11 to you. And of course, the FBI now says, "Oh no, 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 they weren't." But but the strange thing is, I think, yeah, they were. They were the same people.
And someone claiming to be Muhammad Atta showed up at a Department of Agriculture office, field office,
Right.
uh, making himself, I guess, remembered, making making a scene. You want to go into that a little bit? And
Yeah, well, this is one of the curious things about this is that these so-called hijackers, you don't have to be a great genius again to find their footprints, um, both with respect to linking them to 9/11 and linking them to anthrax, because it appears that in many cases they went out of their way to be visible. And Mohammed Atta is the classic example of this, the so-called leader of the 19 hijackers. I mean, the guy, scares people. He threatens to cut people's throats. He kills somebody's cat. He leaves a plane he's training in on the runway. He gets pulled over by the cops. I list all these. I mean, this is not a highly skilled secret operative who pulls off this mass murder. This is a guy who's laying down a trail. And the incident that you're talking about is simply one of the most absurd of these incidents. So this is some months, as I recall, before 9/11, and he goes to the Department of Agriculture in, I guess it's Florida again, and talks to a woman in there about getting a loan. He says, "Well, I'm not a U.S. citizen, but I'm in this country and I have this dream. I want to fly planes. I want to fly crop duster planes, dust some American crops here, and so I need a big loan. I don't remember how much it was, several $100,000." And he really wants to. He seems to think he can walk out of the office with this money virtually, because of course he's told, well, you'd have to apply. It's very complicated. And then she learns he's not a citizen. Well, I'm sorry, you're not eligible. So at that point, he says, well, what's to keep me from coming around the desk here and cutting your throat and then just taking it from the safe? Which is kind of a bizarre thing. I would have thought that's your cue to phone the cops or whatever. But instead, she supposedly, Janelle Bryant, the employee, supposedly tells him, well, in a very calm way, well, we don't keep that kind of money in the safe. And besides, I know karate. I mean, frankly, this whole scene, this whole story seems to me so silly. But anyway, they go on and they continue in their friendly discussion, during the course of which Mohammed Atta supposedly tells her that, he has a great hero named Osama bin Laden who will soon become famous, and that, and he asks her about the Washington and the monuments there, and tells her how vulnerable they are and to attack from the air. He begins talking about the World Trade Center, asks her how secure it is. He'd like to visit there. Um, any obstacles to that? He just goes on and just, I mean, it's absurd. He practically gives away the whole 9/11 event, which is going to be coming in a few months. She apparently is uninterested and doesn't come forward as a witness till after 9/11. So what I see, and of course I should mention, since we're talking about the anthrax attacks, that he wants a plane with a huge tank, large capacity tank, so that he can fly and carry out some kind of very large operation, which he sprays things over the U.S. Well, so this isn't 9/11 he's talking about here. This is an attack with a different kind of weapon of mass destruction, biological or chemical. And from other evidence that we've got, it seems pretty clear that what they're setting up, what this scenario, this story is supposed to do is tell us that Muhammad Atta had access to large quantities of anthrax and intended to spread them through a plane um, over U.S. Cities. And the only place he could have gotten that large amount of anthrax would be Iraq. That's what we were supposed to conclude. Since Iraq at one time had an anthrax program, it was all destroyed by now, but we're not supposed to know that. And aerial dispersion was one of the methods they had been looking into. So in other words, what I'm saying is this seems to be a very complex story that we're being told, a scenario being conjured up that is supposed to tell us that the same guy who headed up the crew that did 9/11 was also planning to do a biological attack on the United States using substances and technology that would link him to both Al Qaeda and Iraq. In other words, this is highly planned, what's going on here. This whole set of stories, laying down footprints and trails for us to follow. There's nothing, just simply opportunistic or random about this. This is a large scale planned fraud being perpetrated on the American people.
And I guess the notion of Muhammad Atta, or the idea of Muhammad Atta going into an office and making a conspicuous nuisance of himself, or even a threat, is very similar to the antics of Lee Harvey Oswald or his doppelganger in the days leading up to the Kennedy assassination. It's kind of it reeks of an intelligence operation, if you know.
Exactly, absolutely. Yeah, it's the same as Muhammad Atta's luggage supposedly not making it onto the final flight of American Airlines 11, which he supposedly, I'm trying to remember this. If I got it right, was it 11 that he piloted? One of the two that went into the World Trade Center. I think it was American Airlines 11. In any case, Muhammad Atta got on the plane, we're told, but for some mysterious reason, his luggage didn't get on the plane. Everyone else's luggage did, but his didn't. So it was left there to be discovered by the authorities. And oh, guess what? There's a Quran, there's a flight manual, there's his last will and testament. And what possible use would his last will and testament be on a flight that's going to crash into the World Trade Center? But there's all this rubbish in his luggage, right, that supposedly shows that he was the perpetrator of 9/11. Very similar kind of intelligence operation, laying down all this silly evidence that we were supposed to follow.
And you have the research of Daniel Hopsinger, who tracked down Muhammad Atta's girlfriend, who was, I guess, has been called a pink-haired stripper.
Right.
But I think she was a lap dancer. I think there might be a distinction within the industry.
I'm afraid I don't know. I'm afraid I genuinely don't know the difference.
Yeah. But regardless, it's not something you associate with, with a pious or devout Muslim.
Right. No, absolutely not. Well, then these guys did all kinds of things that didn't fit with the pious Muslim thing, like getting drunk and sniffing cocaine and doing lap dances. And I mean, they did the whole works.
And attending defense language institutes.
Right.
Military
institutes. That too.
So there's a whole types of connection. But back to the anthrax attacks. So basically, they can't maintain the Muslim perpetrators, so they switch it. It's domestic, because that's where they trace the anthrax to.
Right.
And they go after. They blame a couple of people associated with, I guess, bio weapon research. Want to get into that case, the Hatfield and Ivins case?
Yes. Well, I guess there were several people that they tried to implicate at one time or another. But before we get into that, let's just discuss what I think is happening here. As you can clearly see, once the first attempt to frame, Al Qaeda in Iraq falls apart, what are you going to do? I mean, once these anthrax spores have been identified as clearly coming from a U.S. military biolab, you've got to fairly quickly do some kind of a cover-up. And that's when you go to the fallback position, or what's sometimes called the limited hangout, where you give up some of the truth, but you hide very important aspects of the truth. And one way to do it is through the good old lone wolf, or lone nut, as sometimes called. So a lone nut is especially useful if you can find somebody that's mentally unstable or emotionally fragile, a little out of touch in some way with reality. Then that's especially good, because you can say, you know what, every society has a certain percentage of so-called nuts in it. There's nothing we can do about it. It doesn't tell us anything about our institutions or what's going on. It's just part of the general noise, the background noise of any society. So then, after trying to nail this man called Stephen Hatfield for the crime, and Hatfield fights back and sues them and gets over $5 million in his lawsuit. After that, they go after a scientist at USAMRIID, the United States Army. I always forget what USAMRIID stands for. U.S. Army Military Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, something like that. You can see why they just call it USAMRIID.
Yes,
Anyway,
more awkward acronyms out there.
yeah. So anyway, Dr. Bruce Ivans was a research scientist there. He published all kinds of articles, working away for years, trying to develop an anthrax vaccine. And he had actually aided the FBI in the initial stages of their investigation of the anthrax attacks. But at some point or other, they decide, who knows why, that they're going to make him their chosen perpetrator. And I think it's partly because it was decided he was vulnerable. The term nut, I don't think I don't think it should be used for anybody, but I certainly don't think it should be used for Ivans. But he had some mental and emotional problems. He was taking some medication, and he was, I think, fragile. I think he was a vulnerable man, and they put a lot of pressure on him. They made it clear that they came to his work. They put pressure on his family. They were going to go after him. They were going to seek the death penalty, and it's at that point that he dies. Before he's charged, before he's indicted, he dies suddenly, and that's he could have killed himself. That's the official story, or he could have been killed. Because clearly they didn't want a court case, and I don't know which it is, but in any case, he died, and therefore the FBI breathed a great sigh of relief and said, well, he's the anthrax killer, case closed. The fact that he killed himself just shows that he was feeling guilty, and so that's the end of it. And to this day, the poor man is considered the FBI's official anthrax killer, even though it's an absurdly weak case. And I have to say, it makes me angry that this man and his family should be painted this way, and he's not alive to fight back. I think if it had gone to court, if it had been even a halfway decent trial, and there's no guarantee anymore that it would have been, but if it had been a fair trial, there's no way they could have convicted him. They had nothing.
And they tried to make the claim that he mailed these letters out, but it was demonstrated he simply couldn't have physically done that.
Well, I believe that's true.
Yeah, because he had to travel great distances or something, right?
Yes, the travel, they never had any evidence that he had actually made those trips, and they didn't find any anthrax spores in his car or his house or on his person. They really had nothing like that. Nope. So they tried to build this case by, all kinds of essentially irrelevant things, that he'd had this obsession with sorority girls and, at some point, and so that way you humiliate him publicly, even though it's irrelevant. And then if they play on his emotional instability, they go through all his emails and, he had a crush at one time on an office worker in his, place of location. And it actually is absurd. I mean, when I read the FBI's case, it's on the internet. You can find it, the Amerithrax case. I just thought, is this really the best they can do? This is absurd. And then, of course, recently we've had an former FBI whistleblower who was actually heading up this FBI case for a while, Richard Lambert, and he had a major falling out with the FBI. And he says that, it always was a weak case. And he said, not only is it weak, he said the FBI to this day is sitting on, and this is a direct quote, a wealth of exculpatory evidence. End of quote. In other words, a whole bunch of evidence which indicates Ivans wasn't the culprit. And he said this evidence has still not been released to the public, but they have it. So I actually think I don't spend too much time on the Ivans case in my book because I just think it's so absurd. It's weak. It doesn't go anywhere. I don't see how any serious researcher can take it,
But he conveniently committed suicide, so they could just pin it on him and move
He
on.
Conveniently died, either at his own hand or at the hand of someone else, supposedly taking an overdose of Tylenol. And, as I understand it, there was no autopsy. So I considered a suspicious death.
I've listened to a number of your interviews, and of course I read your book, and you mentioned how a lot of people look at the anthrax case with a sort of befuddlement. they realize the FBI case is very weak,
Right.
if not absurd, and so there's a lot of contempt for the FBI's accusation of Bruce Irons being the perpetrator and the case being closed. But their befuddlement was based on the fact they're not following the logical path that I think what you follow in your book. Since the Anthrax attacks were officially considered an inside job,
Right.
and you find the evidence linking him to 9/11.
Yeah.
What does that tell us not only about the Anthrax attacks themselves, but 9/11 and the greater war on terror?
Right. Yeah. Well, that's it. I think a lot of people who start to do research on 9/11, and this applies to several people who've written books. Sorry about the anthrax attacks, not 9/11. People who've done research on the anthrax attacks, including several authors, get to a certain point and then they just hit the wall and they kind of go, well, I'm not sure I find the FBI case convincing, but I don't know where to go from here. And I don't know why it was done, and I don't know how it's connected to anything else. And the reason they hit the wall is because they almost all assume that the official story of the 9/11 attacks is true. And this is one of the main reasons I wrote my book. I say, I mean, there are bigger books than mine about the anthrax attacks. There are more detailed accounts. There are sophisticated histories, but they're almost all written by people who didn't know anything about 9/11 and who just naively assumed the official story was right. And I say, well, they're never going to solve the anthrax crime. They're just not going to solve it if they think that's the case. You have to understand they were two parts of a single operation. They were both fraudulent. Both the official stories were wrong. They were framing Muslims in both cases. This is what I'm trying to get people to see. And that's, I think, why they're befuddled.
Because, well, if you take 9/11 into account, the government's conspiracy theory, the official story is a conspiracy theory. They never put forth any real evidence to back it up. It's all accusation.
Right. Oh, yeah. The 9/11 story, it seems to me, is so hopelessly weak now.
Mm-hmm.
I have trouble even giving talks on it anymore. I did that for years. I still do it when I'm asked, but it's almost become boring because I think the official account has been proven, and I don't use that word lightly, has been proven to be wrong. The recent booklet by the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth called Beyond Misinformation, which just came out a short while ago. I encourage all your listeners to buy it online. This is a good example of a booklet that demonstrates, beyond all reasonable doubt, that the official story of the destruction of the World Trade Center is false. It's unscientific and false. And I breathed a great sigh of relief when that booklet came out. I was one of the official reviewers who got to read the proofs and make comments and stuff. But I just thought, thank God, they've put it all together, this research that has gone on over all these years. And they've made the case very clearly and simply. And the rest of us can just say to people, if you're interested in this, read the darn booklet, because it's there. It's there now.
I think in your book you mentioned Elias Davidson.
Yes.
And he puts like in bullet points, I think, is the following 5 classes of evidence should have been produced by the U.S. authorities in September 2001 or shortly thereafter. He says, 1, authenticate. I can't say that.
Authenticated.
Yeah. Authenticated flight list. Thank you.
Yeah.
Authenticated boarding cards. Authenticated security videos from the airports. Sworn testimonies of personnel who attended boarding of the aircraft. Formal identification of the bodies or bodily remains from the crash sites, including chain of custody reports. None of that has been manifested.
Right.
And
yeah, no, absolutely.
You have the spectacle of the FBI. Remember, the FBI was asked why Osama bin Laden wasn't wanted for 9/11.
Yeah.
And they said because we have no evidence of his involvement.
That's right. Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, Elias has made the case as clearly as anyone that, the burden of proof doesn't lie on us to prove that, bin Laden didn't do it. The burden of proof in a case like this lies on the FBI to prove that he did do it
Hmm.
and his helpers. And they've got to give us evidence and has to stand up to scrutiny. And they haven't done that. It's no good just claiming that this and that happened and we can't show you the evidence because, it's secret. I mean, that doesn't work anymore. Members of civil society in your country, the US, and in my country, Canada, in every country, are saying, you know what, it's not good enough anymore for our intelligence agencies and police to say, well, I'm sorry, it's secret, it's classified. No, if you don't show us the evidence, we're not going to believe you. And I think it's time for us to be adults and to say this. So when we do say that, we find we get absurd things in response on 9/11. It's just not there. The evidence isn't there.
And that could continue with the alleged death of Osama bin Laden.
Oh yeah,
I
I
mean,
completely agree. Yeah, I
got
think
rid of the body. We dumped it in the ocean.
that's right. Because that's a Muslim country, a Muslim custom. And as several Muslims have said, really? I never heard of that before.
But it was,
There's a great comedy routine by this stand-up guy who's Muslim. I wish I could send it to you, where he says, dumping the body in the ocean is Muslim? That's weird because no Muslim's ever heard of that before. It sounds more like the mafia.
Osama bin Laden sleeps with the fishes. Of course,
Yeah,
the
sleep.
theory is he probably died a decade before.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, he was probably long dead by then.
on ice
And
somewhere. But you can't say, "Oh, we got him, we shot him. Here's supposed mastermind, leader of Al Qaeda. We don't capture him or ask any questions. We just do a double tap and dump his body in the Indian Ocean."
that's right. We shoot him. We don't take any pictures. We don't keep the body. We don't keep we don't do any of that. We dump him in an undisclosed location in the middle of the ocean, and you now have to believe us that we kill him.
But this is the effect of it being on the news. You have some pretty news babe telling you this, and you believe it's true because it's.
Well, I guess a lot of people do. I mean, I find people, including, academics that I got into an argument with this online with a bunch of professors in my own university and they were kind of treating me like this toxic taboo person. Of course, I get that all the time anyway. At the time when the Osama bin Laden killing happened, because I'm just saying to them, well, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? And they were all just so offended that I would question this. And I just think that shows that people are still in a childlike state where they will accept all these claims without realizing that a claim is not the same as evidence. And a claim made by an organization that has been proven to be deceptive time after time, like the FBI, what does it mean to go on believing them? I mean, I'm flabbergasted, frankly.
Well, yeah, my working assumption is that whenever they're telling you something, they're lying. It's what was like never believe anything till it's officially denied. Uh,
Right,
so
right.
yeah, I think in theory, the government can tell the truth, but yeah, I think it's possible, but I don't think it's probable at this point. I think they've gotten so used to it.
Well,
Um,
certainly on any high stakes thing
yeah,
that has to do with war and that has to do especially with this incredibly fraudulent construction, the war on terror, I just immediately disbelieve what they're telling us because, I mean, there was fraud during the Cold War too, but there was such a thing as the Soviet Union, and both they and the US did have, tons of these very dangerous nuclear weapons. And yes, we could all die in a very short space of time. So at least there was some kind of basis for people feeling afraid. But this global war on terror, I've never seen such fraud in my life.
no,
I mean,
yeah, I don't
so,
think Al Qaeda exists in any
well,
tangible
yeah, no,
form.
I
I don't
don't
think it
think
ever
that.
did.
No, I don't think so either. And to the extent that they do, they worked closely with the U.S. intelligence. So
Yeah.
um, suddenly they're supposed to be a replacement for the Soviet Union, you know, and we're all supposed to be cowering in our beds. This is happening in Canada too, by the way. We're going to have an election in a few days, and the current government, the current governing party, the Conservative Party, is hammering away on the terrorist threat, the international terrorism and the domestic threat and all this same thing. Apparently it wins them votes among a certain group of naive, frightened people.
But the basic point here is, again, since the anthrax attacks are officially considered to be an inside job.
Right.
And there is strong evidence linking them to 9/11. And not
Right.
only that is the media and the government linking them to 9/11 themselves.
Right.
That means that suggests to us that 9/11 was too what they call an inside job.
Exactly.
That's the logical path.
That's the
Yeah.
logic, and that's what I hope people will grasp from this book. And that's why I say the anthrax attacks could be an entry point, a gateway into the whole fraudulent, or what we might call the theater of the global war on terror.
And we have to look at it as a theater, not just since we talked about the theater of war, although that might mean something there, because war is much of war really is, although there's death and carnage, it is, a show, propaganda,
Yeah.
But the fact, again, people are watching the news, they're watching these events, and they're watching their favorite news station, whether it's MSNBC or CNN or Fox, and what's chilling is realizing just how controlled the mainstream media is.
Yes,
they're on it themselves. Yeah,
it is chilling.
Yeah,
I mean, I had felt that for a long time and experienced that myself, not only as a guy teaching peace studies, but as a peace activist for many years. And yet, when I wrote this anthrax book, I felt like I was discovering a whole new level of fraud and complicity. It was just amazing to me how major newspapers in the U.S. that I had looked at, and not just in the U.S., but especially in the U.S., Washington Post, New York Times, all these kind of revered newspapers had just been deeply complicit, and obviously were just given a story, and so they repeated it. And whether the journalists themselves knew it was all baloney, or whether they were just, loyally giving what their government contacts were feeding them and thinking it was true. I have no idea. I didn't try and work it out. In other words, were they deliberately fraudulent, or were they just passive, naive passers-on of propaganda? I don't know. But regardless of which is true, what we get is a huge propaganda machine. When people used to say to me that the mainstream media is simply the Department of Propaganda for the government, I thought, well, I like it. It's a nice phrase, but it seems to go a bit too far. And now I'm thinking, well, that's pretty accurate. That's pretty accurate. In terms of the anthrax attacks, that's pretty much how it worked.
Well, even the news has the Pulitzer Prize.
I'm sorry?
The Pulitzer Prize.
Yes.
Well, wasn't Joseph Pulitzer one of the main leaders of, I guess the, main figures of yellow journalism in his day?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that, so I guess I'll have to look it up.
I mean, Pulitzer, and who's the other guy? The guy who started the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, I know who you mean, but it's all gone out of my head at the moment. Hearst.
Hearst. So
yeah, William Randolph Hearst.
So it goes way back. But if you go back into the media itself, you do your research into the media, at least in the United States, is a lot of these guys that started CBS and ABC. They came out of OSS and OWI. These, the Psychological War Department of the U.S. government during World War II.
Right.
And you have the Phil Graeme and the this Washington Post and CIA. His link.
Don't know him. See, that this is your country. You know it better than I do.
Okay, there you go. Okay. Well, he was friends with James Jesus Angleton, and he was all involved in the Kennedy assassination. Of course, he committed suicide too.
Okay.
Just when he was having a dispute with his will regarding a girlfriend of his and Katharine Graham. There's a lot of people believe that he was taken out because of that, but that's a whole other story, another can of worms. But
well, that's another can of worms. But it sounds interesting, yeah.
But I'm saying is the media itself isn't a new thing.
No, it isn't new.
Yeah, it
isn't new. I didn't mean to suggest that, but the level of complicity was new to me. That's all. Yeah.
It's like no longer just when you think you got it all figured out, just something new comes along.
That's right. I always get into this thing of thinking nothing can shock me now. I've been studying this stuff for so many years, but it's not true. I'm still shockable. I'm still shocked all the time.
Well, one other thing I want to get into was that. Another thing is, we get into some of these false flags. There's a consistency here, just some tells or patterns that we look for. One is the presence of the drill.
Right.
And with the anthrax attacks, you had a drill, correct?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I'd call it a drill. Actually, there's a couple of separate ones that were going on, but you're probably thinking of the one that happened several months
Yeah,
before. Yeah, which I discuss in the book. Um,
it was Dark Winter.
yeah, it was called Dark Winter, and I think it was Andrews Air Force Base that it was held at. Um, it's not the same as the cases where there's a drill taking place simultaneously.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
not saying suggesting something
No,
like
like with
something
the
was
London
hijacked and
bombings and
utilized. Yeah,
9/11 and all those,
yeah,
Boston Marathon and
yeah.
all those cases, there were actual drills and exercises and so on going on at the very same time that the actual bombings took place. This was different in the sense that took place in, I think it was June of 2001, several months before. But it's certainly fascinating because of some of the characters who were in it. People who were deeply involved in later pushing the anthrax attacks. And well, I don't know. I don't have my volume here, but I list something like 10 parallels
Mm.
between what happened in that exercise and
There are
what happened.
letters sent out to the media
Yeah. Oh,
to Chief
yes.
Miller.
The exercise, it was an exercise, a training exercise. No, what would we call it? An experimental exercise, really, to find out, how the U.S. would cope with a biological weapons attack. Supposedly, smallpox was the main weapon in the exercise, though anthrax is also mentioned. Letters were sent to the media. Yes, letters were sent to government officials. U.S. civil rights were curtailed. There were attacks on Muslims. It was eventually, this is all in the exercise, felt to have been done by bin Laden's group. Oh, really? And to have been supported by, guess who? Iraq. So they seem to be practicing what then they would later do a few months later.
Yeah, that is interesting to say the
Yeah.
least. So yeah, I mean, the broader topic here. Here, basically, we have false flag attacks. Carrying an attack on your own country and blame it on another country to achieve some sort of geopolitical objective or political objective. Not a new development. It's been done throughout history.
Yes.
But your study, I'd like to get your perspective on this because in your area of studies was peace studies, and
Right.
in your peace studies you come up with an idea called the war system.
Yeah.
What would be the war system?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about that. But I first wanted to make a comment on what you said about false flag attacks not being new. You're right. Many years ago, I did a lot of language study during my PhD, and one of the things I studied was classical Chinese. And back then, I remember reading a particular volume. We all read it together, the Sanguoyani, which was basically, well, I won't go into the details. But anyway, we came across this thing which in classical Chinese is called the Kuroji, which means something like the strategy that uses the self-inflicted wound. So, for example, I might beat myself up, so to speak, hit myself with a hammer, or say to my friend, "Could you beat me up, please?" And then we'll blame so and so for it, and this will have a bunch of strategic, useful effects. So this is this is happening centuries ago during a war in ancient China, and it's so common, this strategy. They had a term for it, the kuroji, the self-inflicted wound. So they didn't use the same term as we use, false flag attack, but it's very similar. So we could say that 9/11 and the anthrax attacks were kuroji, the self-inflicted wound, meant to deceive people. And I just find that fascinating. So the false flag attack has been known for a very long time, and not just in the West, but in all kinds of other places as well. So I just wanted to say that because sometimes people forget that.
Well, people naively ask, well, why would the government attack itself? First of all, that's not attacking itself. The perpetrators aren't attacking themselves.
That's right.
They're
No, it's not.
attacking innocent civilians.
That's true.
Collateral damage.
It's not self-inflicted in the same way as
Yeah.
me hitting myself with a hammer.
Yeah.
That's correct. But it is agents of a particular state attacking members of that state. That's what I meant.
Mm-hmm.
And then blaming it on an external party.
And that can achieve several objectives. It can create. No, a good example is maybe people who've who've well, you can provoke an attack like Pearl Harbor.
That's right.
Right?
That's
People who've
another
done,
way of doing it.
and of course the false flag element there would be the fact that while the Japanese carried out the attack, there is a mountain of evidence of foreknowledge and provocation, meaning that,
Yeah, absolutely.
um,
Foreknowledge, provocation, and even quite detailed planning, you know.
which
How
is
can
tantamount to
how
setting up your own people to get killed. I mean, you don't warn them.
Yeah, I mean that's another kind of kuroji.
Yeah,
But anyway, back to your question
yeah.
about system. It's a complex topic to get into, but I'll say a few words and see if you think it's going anywhere. Um, I guess the first thing to say is peace studies is a complex discipline. Not everyone in it agrees on on the same theory. But some of the great founders of peace and conflict studies, I'm thinking especially of Anatole Rappaport, who was also involved in systems theory and games theory, brilliant man, came up with certain ideas about war that have proven to be very fruitful and certainly had a big impact on me. Um, he said very clearly, don't think about war as an event and don't think about it as a series of events. Think about it as a system. War is a complex system, okay? You can think about it almost, if you want to picture it as a big organism, okay? Which knows how to survive, knows how to adapt, knows how to keep going, and exists in many different states. It can be asleep, it can be awake, it can be passive, it can be aggressive, and it knows how to latch on to societies and adapt to them. And it was a very vivid image. It stuck with me and it's proven to be fruitful. So, in other words, war is not just an effect of other things. You know, if we just had the right government, we wouldn't have any war. That's an illusion, I think. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, thought that if you could get rid of monarchy in Europe and have republican governments, then war would kind of naturally go away. Well, it didn't. War adapted. And socialists, many of them thought that we wouldn't have to worry about war anymore if we could get a couple of nice socialist systems going. Well, it didn't work. Socialism actually was, so-called socialism in the Eastern Bloc was in fact deeply shaped by the war system. It was in a sense vanquished by the war system. So war is itself, it has its own logic. It can adapt to monarchy, republicanism, capitalism, socialism. It can survive for long periods, and it has different states. So, for example, people might say, oh, there's no war now. What a great thing. According to the vision I'm promoting here, the fact that there's not a large-scale lethal conflict going on doesn't mean that war doesn't exist. It means that war is in a dormant or cold state, and that may break into a hot state, a lethal state at any moment. So you might say, well, how on earth could we discern? How could we discover that war system if it's asleep, if it's dormant? How could we measure it? How could we find out its state of health? Well, there are all kinds of ways, it turns out. You look at the toys children are playing with. Do they have war toys? You look at the movies people are watching. Are there war movies? You look at you analyze the statements of political candidates. What are they about? Do they invoke war? Do they think it's a noble thing? Do they praise it? And then you begin measuring. How big is are your military institutions? How many of your young men and women are joining up? What are arms sales like? What is military spending? Is it going up or down? Is it big, little? And pretty soon the beast begins to take shape in front of you, even if it is dormant and you aren't killing anyone at that moment. And that's how we begin to picture this thing called war. And we realize that if we're going to confront it, if we regard it as a curse on humankind, which I do, then we can't just assume that if we fix other things that somehow war will naturally, fade away or whatever. No, it has its own being. It has to be confronted directly. We need to figure out, how do you weaken this system? How do you replace it with a more humane system? So that's the gist.
And of course, in the United States, we have what Eisenhower termed the military-industrial complex.
Yes.
He was very much part of building that complex, so he knew that which he was speaking.
Well, absolutely. I mean, when we talk about the war system, and that phrase, by the way, is quite old. I was surprised to hear war described as a system in the late 1800s, or maybe it was even early 1800s, by anti-war activists in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And by the First and Second World War, the term the war system is being used all the time. And you're right, it doesn't just mean weapons and soldiers. It obviously has to mean those industries that create those weapons, and it has to include the intelligence agencies that are so deeply implicated in all this. Usually the executive arm of government becomes deeply embedded. So all these things are part of this war system.
And of course, war is first which president was it? John Adams? John Quincy Adams?
Don't ask me. I'm
Canadian. You're Canadian. That's right. I'm an American, so I think everyone should know anything about America, right? Basically, yeah, war breeds all the sins.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I think it's morally corrupting and it's intellectually corrupting too, because it's fundamentally a stupid way to interact with other people.
Have you thought of, since the nuclear age, we've gone into this, I guess, low-grade warfare. Obviously not low-grade for the people in the third world.
Right.
But the conflicts seem to have changed. But what we've had in the 20th century is an intensity of what's called psychological warfare.
Yeah, psychological warfare is huge now.
Right.
And of course, the so-called low-intensity warfare, which, as you say, looks low intensity from here.
yeah, it's not.
Yeah, but if you're in the field, it can just mean being killed. So yes, constantly different, changing the nature of war. If people are disgusted suddenly by carpet bombing, then you do something else and you say, "Oh no, this is very accurate. This is just these are smart bombs. They've got cameras in them and they discriminate and they don't kill civilians." And then of course you look at how they're used and you discover that even when that's true, and of course it's often not true. I mean, look at what happened to Médecins Sans Frontières and that hospital recently. But even when it is true, you look at what they're targeting, like in the first Gulf War in 1991. What did the U.S. target? They targeted the hydroelectric stations, the water purification system. My God! And you look at the degradation of the health of Iraqis after that; it was terrible. You have hundreds of thousands of children dying from diarrheal diseases that are preventable because the water system was degraded. So the bomb may have been a smart bomb, relatively speaking, but what it was doing was causing large-scale death, just as if you had done carpet bombing.
Yes, because if you take a society that's an urban environment and you bomb the city and destroy its infrastructure, you're going to have people die of all types of diseases, malnutrition, waterborne diseases. And what's most disgusting about that is that we now have the DoD documents that show that was expected.
Exactly. This was quite purposeful. We have the what was it, January 1991 document, which was discovered by Thomas Nagy, or I can't remember, maybe Tom pronounced it Nagy. I think he does. Anyway, and there it is. They studied the effects that sanctions were having on the Iraqi water supply system. They said if this is kept up, pretty soon they'll be fully degraded, and we can expect the following epidemic diseases. And after having received that report was received by the U.S. military and the U.K. military. After receiving that document, they went to war and actually deliberately targeted the very, institutions that would be needed to repair all those systems. So that's pretty intentional. And given the number of children that died because of those things, which is probably around 500,000, it's arguably genocide.
That's like in the Gaza Strip where the Israelis keep a caloric chart.
Oh yeah,
to make sure that the people there do not get enough calories to develop properly. So it's
I agree with you, and I had a discussion about this with two former high-ranking UN officials who both agreed that, yeah, what the Israelis are doing probably is genocide under the Genocide Convention.
So, well, like according to Madame Albright, it's worth it, right? So,
right. Oh my God.
Well, Professor MacQueen, I want to thank you for coming on tonight to discuss this. The book is the 2001 Anthrax Deception: The Case for Domestic Conspiracy. It's by Clarity Press.
Yes.
And you can get the book there, I guess, at their website.
That's the best place to get it. You can get it on Amazon, but go to Clarity Press and buy it from there.
Okay, well, thank you for coming on tonight.
Thank you, Tim. Good questions, and I really enjoyed the discussion.
I enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Thank you. All the best.